Have you ever thought about the invisible rules that shape the world around us? I mean, the ones that govern our actual land? Well, today, we're diving into servitudes and easements. These are the legal agreements that decide who gets to cross your property, where the power company can put its lines, and how a promise made 100 years ago can still be in charge today. Let's get into it.
Right? This isn't just some random quirk of owning property. It's actually a really fundamental problem that law has to solve. How do you make a private agreement about land use last longer than the people who first shook hands on it?
So just imagine two neighbors. They make a simple deal to share a driveway. Makes sense. But then, what happens when one of them sells their house? Does the brand new owner have to honor that old agreement? If they don't, the whole thing just falls apart. So to make these promises stick to the property itself and not just the people, you need a special kind of legal tool.
And that tool is called a servitude. Now, the key phrase here, the one you absolutely need to remember, is that it runs with the land. What this means is that the right or the restriction basically becomes part of the property's DNA. It automatically gets passed on to every single new owner, no questions asked. And this is what creates stability for everything from utility access to entire planned communities. Okay, now I am not going to sit here and pretend this is simple stuff. The famous Professor Susan French once called this area of law an unspeakable quagmire. And you know what? She was not wrong. It is a legal field built on centuries of really old English ideas, with totally different rules in every state. It's a maze. But don't worry, the whole point of this explainer is to give you a clear map to get through all that confusion.
All right, so the most common tool you'll find in the servitude toolbox is the easement. And to really get what an easement is, we first have to understand that servitudes basically come in two major flavors. Ones that give you a right, and ones that create a restriction.
So, the whole thing really boils down to the difference between do and don't. An affirmative servitude, which we call an easement, is a right to do something, like crossing your neighbor's yard to get to the beach. A negative servitude, which is usually called a covenant, is a promise not to do something, like building a huge fence that would block your neighbor's ocean view. For now, we're going to focus on the do kind, easements. And I promise you have seen these out in the wild. A right-of-way is that classic shared driveway or a path. Utility easements are what let the power and internet companies run their cables across everyone's property. And then there's something called a profit. It's short for a fancy old term, profit apprender, which gives someone the right to take a resource, like timber or water. And of course, conservation easements are used to protect natural spaces from ever being developed. So how do you actually create one of these powerful things, an express easement, so that it legally binds every single future owner? Well, it's not as simple as a handshake. There are 3 essential rules that you absolutely have to follow.
First, it has got to be in writing. This is to satisfy a very old law called the Statute of Frauds. Second, and this one is so important, all future owners have to have notice that this thing exists. And third, it has to be super clear that the original folks who made the deal intended for it to run with the land, and not just be a personal promise between the two of them.
Let's just zero in on notice for a second, because this is really all about fairness. Think about it. You can't be held to some restriction if you had absolutely no way of knowing it existed when you bought the place. The law is designed to protect buyers from being ambushed by these kinds of hidden obligations. And the law says you can have notice in one of 3 ways. First is actual notice, which is easy. Someone literally told you about it. Then there's inquiry notice. This means there are physical clues, like a worn-down path or some obvious power lines, that should make you think, I should probably ask what's going on here. And finally, there's constructive notice. This means the easement was properly recorded down at the county courthouse. Legally speaking, you're expected to know it's there, even if you never bothered to look. Okay, now we're getting to the #1 source of confusion and, frankly, a lot of lawsuits over easements. Because even when an easement is perfectly written down and recorded, figuring out who exactly it's supposed to benefit, well, that can get really tricky. This is the million-dollar question. Was this right to cross the property meant for the benefit of the land next door, no matter who owns it? Or was it just a personal favor given to one specific person? The answer to that question changes everything because it determines whether the easement lives on after the property gets sold. And this brings us to 2 really critical legal terms, appurtenant and in gross. An appurtenant easement benefits a piece of land. We call that land the dominant estate. So think of that driveway easement. It's attached to parcel A, and it passes right along to the next owner.
On the other hand, an easement in gross benefits a person or a company, no matter what land they happen to own. And the absolute classic example here is the utility company's right to run its power lines across your yard.
So what happens when the document is kind of vague? Well, the courts have a default setting. As the court said in a really important case called Green v. Lupo, there is a strong legal presumption that easements are appertinent. Basically, courts don't really like personal easements, those easements in gross, because they prefer to keep the benefit attached to the land. It just makes property rights way more predictable and stable for everyone.
The big lesson from that case is that the purpose of the easement is often the biggest clue to what the original parties wanted. I mean, an easement for ingress and egress, that's just lawyer speak for getting in and out, is pretty clearly meant to benefit the land itself. After all, why would a person need access if not to get to their property? So I know we've been getting into some pretty technical legal rules here, but why does any of this stuff really matter? Because these seemingly small, nerdy agreements are actually the fundamental building blocks of our entire modern world. Seriously, without servitudes, you couldn't have condos with their shared walls and common areas. You couldn't have a reliable power grid or fiber optic cables running to your house. You couldn't set up permanent conservation areas to protect nature. They are the invisible legal skeleton that makes all this complex, long-term land use even possible. At the end of the day, what servitudes provide is predictability and certainty. And that's what people and companies need before they're going to invest huge amounts of time and money into projects that are meant to last for generations. They are what turn a simple promise between two neighbors into a permanent feature of the land itself. But this all leads to a huge, critical question for our future. These agreements can and often do last forever, but our world, our technology, our communities, they are changing faster than ever. So, how do we balance these permanent promises from the past with our need to grow and adapt? That is the fascinating, ongoing challenge right at the heart of property law.